Imagine trading a frozen airport floor for a fortress of spun glass and silk. For 3 weeks, Emmanuella Clarke lived in a velvet-lined dream, anchored by the very man who once existed only as a blurred memory from a New York gala. Jin Min, the Ice King, had traded his dragon's fire for the steady rhythm of a nursery, proving that even a monster can learn the lullaby of a heartbeat. But in the world of the Mafia, peace is nothing more than a high-interest loan with a predatory collection date. While the city of Seoul sparkled below their penthouse, destiny was busy sharpening its blades in the dark. The fairy tale didn't end with a rescue. It fractured in a delivery room under the sterile glare of LED lights and the rhythmic thrum of a monitor about to scream a secret. Emmanuella was left to freeze while the world moved on, but she found a protector in the shadows. You found this story, but will you let it disappear into the void of the internet just like Daniel tried to do to her? Before the genetic truth shatters their lives, tell me, which corner of the world are you watching from tonight? Don't let the algorithm abandon you like the parks abandoned Emmanuella. Hit that subscribe button now to ensure you're here for the fallout. It costs you nothing to stay, unlike the heavy price she is about to pay. The private wing of Seoul International Hospital didn't feel like a place of healing. It felt like a command center. Jin Min had seized the entire 4th floor, replacing the usual orderlies with men whose suits hid the silhouettes of suppressed sidearms. He paced the corridor like a caged predator, his presence a heavy, suffocating weight that made even the most senior surgeons sweat through their scrubs. For 19 hours, the only sound in the hallway was the measured click of his boots and the distant, muffled gasps of the woman who had become his entire world. Inside the suite, Emmanuella was drowning in a sea of white linen and agony. Every contraction felt like a tectonic shift, a violent reminder of the two worlds colliding inside her. She looked at Jin Min, the man who had dismantled an $8 billion empire just to see her smile, and saw a flicker of something he never showed the world. Raw, unadulterated terror. He held her hand with a grip that could crush bone, yet his touch remained as light as a prayer. "Stay with me, Ella," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that grounded her. "The world outside doesn't exist, only this." When the first baby finally arrived, the room erupted into a controlled chaos of medical efficiency. A boy. He was a masterpiece of porcelain skin and a shock of dark, silken hair, letting out a cry that sounded less like a wail and more like a challenge to the universe. Jin Min took the child, his tattooed forearms cradling the infant with a reverence that felt almost holy. He looked down at the boy, Jihoon, and for a second the Ice King melted. The child had Jin Min's obsidian eyes, even in the hazy focus of a newborn. "He's perfect," Jin Min whispered, the words catching in his throat. "He has my soul." The doctor, however, was not looking at the father. She was looking at the monitors. "Don't get comfortable, Mr. Jin. We have a stowaway." The air in the room turned to liquid nitrogen. Emmanuella's vision blurred as a fresh wave of pain, sharper and more demanding than the last, ripped through her. She hadn't allowed the doctors to perform detailed ultrasounds in the final weeks. She had wanted one part of this chaotic journey to be a surprise. She had wanted a gift she didn't have to plan for. Surprise was an understatement. 20 minutes later, the second twin was born. But as the nurse moved to place him beside his brother, the room fell into a deafening, suffocating silence. It was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the ward. Emmanuella looked down at the 2 infants in her arms, and her heart didn't just skip, it stopped. Jihoon, the firstborn, was a mirror of the man standing by the bed. He was sharp lines and shadows, a miniature version of the Korean dynasty he was born to inherit. But the second boy, whom she had mentally named Emmett, was a ghost from a different life. He was softer, his complexion several shades lighter, his features carrying the unmistakable, delicate architecture of Daniel Park. They weren't just twins, they were a biological impossibility, a genetic crossroads. Jin Min's gaze shifted from the first child to the second. The warmth in his eyes didn't just fade, it crystallized into a terrifying, familiar frost. He didn't yell, he didn't storm out. He simply stood there, a statue of ancient, vengeful stone, as he realized that the woman he loved had brought both his future and his enemy's legacy into his sanctuary at the exact same time. "Doctor," Jin Min said, his voice so quiet it was a threat. "I want a DNA profile. I want it before the sun touches the horizon. And if a single soul outside this room breathes a word of what they see in those cradles, they won't live to see the results." The war for the Park Empire was over, but the war for the Clark Min bloodline had just fired its first shot. The 6 hours it took for the DNA results to process felt less like time and more like a slow-motion descent into a frozen abyss. In the recovery room, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the heavy silence of a man who could command armies, but was currently powerless against the code written in blood. Jin Min didn't sit. He stood by the window, a silhouette of sharp angles against the neon-pulsing veins of Seoul, watching the city as if he were waiting for it to catch fire. Behind him, Emmanuella lay in the bed, the two infants sleeping in acrylic basins, two tiny enigmas wrapped in hospital-grade cotton. When Dr. Yoon finally entered, the click of her heels sounded like a hammer hitting a nail. She didn't offer a polite smile or a soft introduction. She carried a single folder, the paper inside holding the power to either solidify a dynasty or burn it to the ground. She looked at Emmanuella with a clinical pity before turning to Jin Min, whose eyes were as cold and unyielding as the Han River in January. "It is a phenomenon known as heteropaternal superfecundation," Dr. Yoon began, her voice steady despite the predatory energy radiating from the man in front of her. "It is a biological lightning strike, occurring in roughly 1 out of every 400,000 twin births. It happens when a woman releases 2 eggs during a single cycle, and those eggs are fertilized by different donors within a razor-thin window of time." The doctor laid the documents on the table, the black ink stark against the white page. "The biology confirms the calendar. The firstborn, twin A, Ji-hoon, is a 99.9% match to you, Mr. Jin. He is your biological heir." She paused, the weight of the next sentence hanging in the air like a guillotine. "Twin B, Emmett, shares no genetic markers with you. His biological father is Daniel Park." Emmanuella felt the world tilt on its axis. The memory of that week in April returned with a sickening clarity. The intoxicating, blurred night in New York, with the mysterious stranger on April 2nd, followed by a desperate, final attempt to salvage her crumbling marriage with Daniel on April 4th. 72 hours, a 3-day window where her life had branched into 2 separate destinies, both of which had now arrived in the form of 2 sleeping boys. Jin Min didn't move. He didn't even blink. He looked down at the paper, tracing the name Ji-hoon and then the name Emmett, with a gaze that felt like it was carving the words into stone. The silence stretched until it was physically painful. Emmanuella watched the muscles in his jaw tighten, the dragon tattoo on his forearm seeming to coil and flex as his fists clenched. "One is mine," Jin Min whispered, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. "And the other belongs to the man who left you to die in the snow." He turned slowly to look at the two bassinets. Ji-hoon was his blood, the sharp features, the dark intensity already beginning to manifest in the infant's restful face. But Emmett was the living, breathing proof of her past, a child who bore the softer complexion and the genetic blueprint of the Park family, the very people Jin Min had vowed to erase from existence. Legally, Dr. Yoon added softly, since the marriage was still active at the time of conception, the Parks can do nothing, Jin Min interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register that made the doctor take a half-step back. "I don't care about the laws of men. I care about what is mine. This child, both of these children, are under my shadow now." He walked over to the bassinet holding Emmett, the boy who wasn't his. For a long, terrifying moment, Emmanuella held her breath, fearing the monster within him would see the child only as a rival's weed to be uprooted. But Jin Min reached out, his finger grazing the infant's cheek with a tenderness that was almost agonizing to witness. "They were born at the same time," Jin Min said, looking at Emmanuella. "They shared the same womb. They will share the same protection. But make no mistake, Ella, the truth we are holding is a grenade. If the Parks find out they have a biological claim to one of these boys, they won't use it for love. They will use it as a crowbar to pry their way back into power." He picked up the DNA results and crumpled them in his hand, his eyes locking onto Emmanuella's with a fierce, possessive fire. "No one else sees these. No one else knows. As far as the world is concerned, I am the father of both. We bury this secret today." But as he spoke, miles away in a darkened office, a nurse was already sending a digital file to a private encrypted server. The secret wasn't buried. It was already being sold. The hospital was a fortress, but even the strongest walls have cracks where the shadows of old sins can seep through. While Jin Min stood guard over the cradle of his new world, the ghosts of his old one were gathering at the service entrance. In the hierarchy of power, information is the most volatile currency, and in Seoul, revenge isn't always delivered with a bullet. Sometimes it is sent as a high-resolution attachment. Nurse Han didn't look like a revolutionary. She looked like a woman weary of 12-hour shifts and the sterile, clinging scent of medication. But beneath her professional veneer burned a cold, quiet rage. Her family had been a casualty of the Ice King's ambition. Her brother had once owned a thriving logistics company, a subsidiary in the eyes of the giants, until Jin Min's trading floor decided to short every asset they touched during his demolition of the Park Empire. In 3 hours of market carnage, her family's legacy had been reduced to a pile of bankruptcy filings and a quiet apology in a cramped apartment. As she stood at the nursing station, the encrypted file on her tablet felt heavier than a weapon. She had watched Jin Min cradle the firstborn with the reverence of a saint, but she had also seen the flicker of something else when he looked at the second child. She had seen the DNA results before Jin Min had turned them into a fistful of crumpled paper. With a single tap, she sent the file. It wasn't about money, though the anonymous deposit into her account would ensure she never had to smell hospital antiseptic again. It was about balance, miles away in a cramped apartment that felt like a prison compared to the Gangnam estate she had lost. Mrs. Park sat in the dark. The family purity she once toasted to on a private jet was a shattered memory. She had been reduced to a life of remembering what she had lost, her name wiped from every record by Jin Min's hand. The merciful existence Emmanuella had granted her was a slow-acting poison that Mrs. Park intended to spit back. Her phone chimed. The notification light was the only thing illuminating her face. She opened the file. She read the words heteropaternal superfecundation. She saw the names Jihoon and Emmett. A slow, jagged smile spread across her face. The kind of smile a predator wears when it realizes the trap has finally sprung. Paternity is such a delicate matter after all, she whispered, echoing the words she had once used to break Emmanuella at the airport. She didn't call her lawyers first. She called Daniel. Daniel sat in the shadows of his own living room, a man who had become a ghost in his own life. He had watched his wife, the woman he had treated as a delightful experiment, be carried away by a man who actually knew how to protect her. He had seen the divorce papers, pre-signed and dated, and felt the shame of his own cowardice. "Mother, it's 3 a.m, Daniel said, his voice hollow. "It's the morning of our resurrection, Daniel," she hissed. "The Ice King thinks he's built a sanctuary. He thinks he can own the table and our legacy. But he's feeding a park heir in his own house. He's protecting my grandson." She forwarded the image to him. Daniel looked at the screen, at the face of Twin B, and saw the undeniable echo of his own features. The guilt that had been eating at him didn't vanish. It transformed into a new, terrifying obligation. Back at the hospital, Emmanuella was being cleared for discharge. She walked through the corridor, holding the boys, feeling the phantom weight of the secret she and Jin Min shared. She felt safe under the gaze of the men in suits, believing the world ended at the hospital's exit. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from an unknown number, Daniel's old personal line. "We know about the twins, Ella. We know one of them carries my blood. You can try to hide behind your Mafia king, but you can't hide from the truth. We're coming for our grandson." The paper cup of water in her hand slipped, splashing onto the polished floor. The fortress hadn't just been breached, the enemy was already inside the gate. The Parks did not simply file a lawsuit. They launched a scorched earth campaign designed to bury Emmanuella and Jin Min under a mountain of litigation. In the high-stakes theatre of Seoul's family courts, the scales of justice were often weighted by the sheer volume of gold and ink a family could throw onto the pans. The Park's legal team was a phalanx of 15 elite attorneys, men and women who had built careers on finding loopholes in the unbreakable. They arrived at the private family court not with arguments but with a mandate: to reclaim the Park blood that had been stolen by a Chicago street girl and a Mafia kingpin. The hearing was held in a chamber that felt more like a bunker than a courtroom, a windowless, wood-panelled room where the air was filtered and the secrets were kept under heavy lock and key. Mrs. Park arrived dressed in exquisite mourning black, her face a carefully constructed mask of the grieving matriarch. She clutched a lace handkerchief as if it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing, a performance of grandmotherly heartbreak that would have been convincing if not for the predatory glint in her eyes whenever she looked at the twins' bassinets. Daniel sat beside her, his tailored suit fitting him like a straitjacket, his eyes fixed on the floor as if trying to disappear into the polish of the marble. The Park family attorney stood first, his voice a calculated mix of outrage and authority. "Your Honor, we are here to correct a biological travesty. A DNA test, conducted by the very hospital where these children were born, proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Twin B, Emmett, is the biological son of Daniel Park. He was conceived while the parties were still legally wedded. Under the law of this land, a father has an inalienable right to his flesh and blood. You cannot allow a child of the Park dynasty to be raised in a den of organized crime." Jin Min's lead attorney, Kang Seo-yeon, didn't even stand up until the silence in the room became uncomfortable. Known as the Great White of the Seoul Bar, She moved with the lethality of a shark scenting a shipwreck. She didn't lead with DNA. She led with a projector. The Park family speaks of inalienable rights and flesh and blood, Seo-yeon began, her voice cutting through the room's tension. But let us examine the moment those rights were supposedly exercised. The courtroom lights dimmed, and the screens flickered to life. It was the security footage from December 24th, the private terminal at the airport. The court watched in silence as Mrs. Park descended the stairs of a private jet, the click of her Louboutins audible even through the grain of the recording. They saw her strip Emmanuella of her passport and credit cards. They heard the audio, crisp and damning, as she told a woman 8 months pregnant that she was a charity case from Chicago projects, who didn't belong in their dynasty. The footage showed Daniel standing by as his mother dropped Emmanuella's empty purse at her feet like scraps for a dog, before watching his wife collapse in a frozen terminal as their jet disappeared into the snow. They didn't want this child when they thought he was theirs, Seo-yeon continued, pointing at the screen where Daniel had looked at Emmanuella's pregnant belly with disgust. They abandoned her in a frozen airport, leaving her with 3% battery and no way to survive. They intended for that child to be erased from every document. But now that Mr. Jin has provided a sanctuary, they suddenly find their parental instincts. This isn't a custody claim, Your Honor. It's an attempt at a hostile takeover of a human life. The judge, a woman who had seen the worst of Seoul's elite, turned her gaze to Daniel. Mr. Park, do you have anything to say in your defense? Daniel stood slowly, his face pale. He looked at Emmanuella, then at the child who shared his eyes but not his name. I never wanted this, he said, his voice cracking the heavy silence. My mother, she told me the child wasn't mine to justify what we did. Now she wants the child because it's the only leverage she has left against the man who broke us. These babies, they deserve a father who stays, and I have never been that man. Mrs. Park let out a sharp, choked gasp of rage, but the judge's gavel silenced the room. Custody remains entirely with Ms. Clark. The Park family is hereby denied all parental and visitation rights. You will maintain a distance of 500 meters from these children and their guardians at all times. This matter is closed. Jin Min won. He didn't smile and he didn't gloat. He simply stood and placed his hand on the small of Emmanuella's back, guiding her out of the room. But as they passed Mrs. Park, the older woman didn't look defeated. She looked like a woman who was done with the law and ready for the dark. The courtroom may have ruled in Ella's favor, but the war for her children's souls is only just beginning. We watch her fight for her family from the safety of our screens. But are you really going to walk away without showing a shred of support for her journey? Subscribing is the only way to prove you stand with the mother who refused to be silenced by old money and cold hearts. If you don't hit that button now, you're choosing to let her struggle fade into the shadows. Don't be like Daniel and look away when the stakes are at their highest. The pediatrician's office was a cathedral of primary colours and the soft rhythmic squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. It was supposed to be a sanctuary of mundane concerns, weight charts, vaccination schedules, and the milestones of a healthy infancy. For the first time in months, Emmanuella felt the tension in her shoulders start to fray. Jin Min had surrounded the clinic with a wall of muscle, but inside the exam room, the only sounds were the gurgles of 2 thriving boys. The Ice King himself sat in a chair designed for a much smaller man, his eyes tracking the movement of a plastic mobile as if it were a tactical maneuver. But the piece was a thin crust over a volcanic fault line. At exactly 2:47 p.m., the sterile quiet was shattered. The fire alarm didn't just ring, it screamed, a high-pitched, jagged strobe of sound that instantly turned the orderly clinic into a panicked hive. Smoke, thick, chemical, and smelling of burnt insulation, began to curl from the ventilation grates. In the world of high-stakes extraction, chaos is the most effective cloaking device. "Protocol, move!" Jin Min's voice sliced through the cacophony, his transition from father back to predator instantaneous. The evacuation was a blur of adrenaline and white noise. Emmanuella clutched Ji-hoon to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. A nurse in a pristine blue uniform appeared at her side, her movements precise and calming. "I have the other one, Ma'am. Follow the security team to the stairwell. Fast." In the crushing press of the crowd and the blinding pulse of the alarm lights, Emmanuella saw the nurse duck into the service corridor with Emmett. She assumed it was a shortcut, a tactical exit designed by Jin Min's men. It wasn't until she reached the sidewalk, surrounded by the frigid Seoul air and the frantic tally of the security detail, that the world stopped spinning and began to tilt into a nightmare. "Where is the second nurse?" Jin Min roared, his eyes scanning the sea of panicked faces. "Where is Emmett?" The realization didn't come as a shock. It arrived as a cold, paralyzing death. 10 minutes later, Jin Min's men found the real Nurse Kim bound and unconscious in a supply closet, her uniform and badge stripped from her body. The security footage from the parking garage showed a black van with obscured plates blowing through the exit gate at 2:51 p.m. Jin Min didn't scream. He didn't rage. He simply became something else. A creature of pure, focused destruction. "Lock it down," he said into his phone, his voice a low-frequency vibration that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "I want every bridge on the Han River closed. I want the airport grounded. I want every ship in the harbour pinned to the dock. If a pigeon flies out of this city, I want to know its flight path." For 6 hours, Seoul became a police state under a shadow government. Jin Min didn't just use his men. He called in every det, activated every sleeper cell, and turned the city's digital infrastructure into a search engine for one specific heartbeat. The Park family mansion was surrounded by a fleet of black SUVs within 20 minutes, his men pulling the gates off their hinges with chains. They found Emmett in a nondescript apartment in a forgotten corner of the Mapo district, a safe house rented under a shell company that traced back to a former Park Industries accountant. He was unharmed, sleeping in a travel bassinet as if the world weren't burning down around him. The fallout was absolute. Mrs. Park was taken away in handcuffs, her face a mask of defiant, aristocratic madness even as she was pushed into the back of a squad car. Daniel sat in a separate vehicle, his head in his hands, a man who had finally realized that his mother's legacy was nothing more than a graveyard. When Jin Min placed Emmett back into Emmanuella's arms, his hands were shaking, a tremor that no one in the underworld had ever seen. He looked at her, his eyes hollowed out by the sheer terror of the last 6 hours. "He's safe," Jin Min whispered, but the words felt like a lie. Emmanuella looked at her sons, one his blood, one his enemies, and felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The penthouse wasn't a fortress, it was a target. The protection wasn't a shield, it was a magnet for violence. She looked at the man who had traded his soul to save her child, and in that moment, she made the hardest decision of her life. "This has to end, Jin Min," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the aftermath of the storm. "We are leaving." The office was a tomb of blue light and humming servers, a digital war room where Jin Min sat like a ghost, haunting his own empire. At 3 a.m, the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse didn't offer a view. They offered a mirror of a man who had built a fortress and found himself trapped inside it. Screens flickered with the jagged lines of stock markets and the grain of security feeds. 1,000 eyes watching a world that was constantly trying to claw its way into his sanctuary. Emmanuella stood in the doorway, a soft silhouette of cotton and maternal warmth against the cold, metallic precision of the room. She held Jehoon, who was a warm weight against her chest, while Emmett slept in the nursery nearby, guarded by men who had forgotten how to breathe without a hand on a holster. "I'm leaving," she said. Her voice wasn't a scream, it was a quiet, tectonic shift that silenced the hum of the computers. Jin Min didn't turn at first. His shoulders, usually as unyielding as granite, seemed to sag under the weight of the two words. When he finally looked at her, the Ice King was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he had finally met an enemy he couldn't outcalculate. "What?" he whispered, the word carrying a raw, jagged fear. "Not you," she clarified, stepping into the room, her bare feet silent on the expensive carpet. "But this constant state of siege, the way we count heartbeats like we're counting down a fuse." She sat across from him, the blue light of the monitors casting long, ghoulish shadows over her face. "You told me I'd never have to beg for a place at a table again. You told me I'd own it. But what good is a table if my children have to sit underneath it to avoid the crossfire?" "I can protect you, Ella," he said, his voice a low, desperate vibration. "I've turned this city into a cage for anyone who even thinks about touching you." "And that's the problem," she countered gently. "I don't want my sons to grow up in a cage, even if the bars are made of gold. I want them to grow up in Chicago. I want them to know the smell of cut grass and the sound of a school bell, not the static of a radio and the click of a safety being disengaged." Jin Min stood and walked to the window, staring out at the Han River as if he were looking for an exit strategy that didn't involve losing his heart. The silence stretched until it felt like it might snap. "You think I'll let you take my sons across the world?" he asked, but there was no threat in his voice, only a profound, hollow devastation. "I think you'll do what's best for them," she said, "even if it kills you." He turned back to her, his eyes bright with a rare, crystalline moisture. "I'll buy you a house," he conceded, the surrender sounding like a death sentence. "Wherever you want, Lincoln Park, the Gold Coast, anywhere. I'll set up security that's invisible, a ghost net you'll never even feel. And I'll visit. Every month, I won't miss a single birthday or a school play. I'll be the shadow that ensures their sun never sets." "You'd give up the empire?" she asked. "I'd burn it all down just to keep the warmth in this room," he replied, his voice breaking. Emmanuella stood and crossed the distance between them, placing her hand over his heart, which was racing like a trapped engine. "Then don't be a shadow, Jin Min. Come with us. Be the man who stays." "I can't just walk away, Ella. The business, the rivals. If I leave, the vacuum I leave behind will be filled with blood. Yuri is the best strategist you've ever trained. Let him rule the shadows," she urged, her eyes locking onto his. "You told me our sons would inherit an empire of steel. But I'd rather they inherit a father who is present. You can build businesses anywhere in the world, Jin Min, but you can't build back the years you'll miss while you're busy guarding a throne in a city that doesn't love you." She leaned her forehead against his. "You're asking me to choose between who I am and who I want to be," he whispered. "No," she corrected him. "I'm asking you to choose who you want to become." 6 months later, the predatory sirens of Seoul and the humming servers of a Gangnam war room felt like echoes from a previous incarnation. In Lincoln Park, Chicago, the winter was different. It wasn't a weapon used to strand a pregnant woman in a frozen terminal. It was a soft, white shroud that quieted the world and turned the city into a sanctuary. Inside a brownstone that smelled of cinnamon and floor wax, The only Ice King present was a man struggling to decipher the IKEA instructions for a double crib. Jin Min sat on the hardwood floor, surrounded by hex keys and wooden slats, swearing softly in Korean at a bracket that refused to align. The man who had once dismantled an $8 billion empire in 12 hours was currently being defeated by a piece of Scandinavian engineering. Emmanuella watched him from the doorway, a mug of tea between her hands. The transition had been a series of small, quiet miracles. Yuri remained in Seoul, acting as the invisible hand that guided the shadows, while Jin Min managed the legitimate side of his interests through encrypted calls that ended strictly at 5 p.m. He had traded his black overcoats for soft cashmere sweaters, though the dragon tattoo on his forearm still coiled with a dark, protective intensity whenever he reached out to steady a wobbly toddler. The boys, Jihoon and Emmett, were the living proof that blood was the least interesting thing about a family. They practiced rolling over on a quilted blanket, their cries and gurgles operating in a synchronized chaos that filled the house with life. Emmanuella's brother had wept when he first held them, and even her mother, who had once stayed silent during Emmanuella's struggles, had flown in from Atlanta to offer an apology written in homemade meals and long, quiet afternoons of childcare. The street girl from Chicago had come home, not as a dismissed experiment, but as the architect of her own destiny. The news from Korea arrived in thin, occasional trickles. The Park Empire hadn't just fallen, it had been reclaimed by the very earth it tried to dominate. Mrs. Park, stripped of the Gangnam estate and the Louboutin she used to click across marble floors, now spent her days teaching etiquette classes to the nouveau riche, selling the ghost of a prestige she no longer possessed. Daniel had sent a card on the twins' first birthday. It contained no excuses, just a single line, "I am sorry I wasn't better," and a check that would ensure the boys never had to worry about the cost of a dream. Emmanuella had deposited the money for their future and burned the card, letting the ash of the Park legacy blow away in the Chicago wind. Jin Min finally clicked the last bracket into place and stood, stretching his corded muscles as he looked at the finished crib. He walked over to Emmanuella, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice the same low, grounding vibration that had saved her in a hospital room months ago. "How quiet it is," she whispered, leaning back into him. "I thought I wanted power, but I actually just wanted to be safe. I thought I wanted a table, but I just wanted a home." "You have both," he murmured, kissing her forehead. "And no one is ever taking them away again." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in a blank page of white. The story that began with a betrayal at an airport gate had ended with a vow kept in the heart of a home. Emmanuella wasn't just surviving, she was building a dynasty of her own, one written in love, protected by steel, and defined by the choice to stay. Emmanuella Clarke's journey began with a woman abandoned and broken, but it ends with a queen who built her own kingdom on her own terms. She didn't need a mafia empire to find her strength. She only needed the courage to choose a different path for her children. If this story reminded you that your value isn't defined by how people treat you, but by how you rise after they leave, then join us. Hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to know that starting over isn't a defeat. It's the birth of a new power. This concludes the saga of the Clarke Min family. But for anyone out there waiting for their justice, your next chapter is just beginning.